October 15th, 1972. Fox Theater, Detroit. The dressing room mirror reflected a man who looked older than his 33 years. Marvin Gaye sat alone, staring at hands that hadn't held a microphone on stage for 2 years, 7 months, and 12 days. Not since that night in Hampton when Tammy collapsed in his arms. Tonight, Berry Gordy had given him 15 minutes. Stevie Wonder was headlining with a full hour. The Four Tops got 30 minutes. The Temptations commanded 45. But Marvin, the man who had once been called the Prince of Motown, was allocated just 15 minutes at Detroit's inner-city relief concert. The hierarchy backstage was unmistakable. Stevie moved through the corridors like musical royalty, his blindness somehow making him more perceptive to everyone's energy. The Four Tops held court with stories that had roadies laughing. The Temptations rehearsed their choreography with military precision. And somewhere in a corner, almost forgotten, sat Marvin. He had arrived that afternoon with minimal fanfare. No entourage, no backup singers, just his guitar case and a head full of memories he couldn't escape. The drive from his outer drive home had taken 47 minutes, but Marvin had stretched it into 2 hours, stopping 3 times, sitting in his Cadillac, questioning whether he should turn around. The last time he had been in this theater was December 1969 with Tammy. She had been weak then, between surgeries, but insisted on one final Detroit show. For the home crowd, she had whispered in the dressing room, applying makeup to hide the surgical scars. That night she had forgotten lyrics twice, and Marvin had carried the songs alone while she smiled and nodded, pretending everything was normal. Now the other performers acknowledged him politely, but conversations somehow shifted when he approached. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was something more complicated. Pity mixed with uncertainty, the way people looked at widows at church socials. "What's he doing here?" Marvin had overheard a session musician whisper. "Man hasn't performed live since Tammy died. Heard he can barely get through a recording session without breaking down." Another voice had chimed in, barely audible but cutting. "Barry only invited him out of loyalty. Feels sorry for him." Marvin pretended not to hear, but each comment settled like sediment in his chest. The kid from Washington, D.C., who had once dreamed of singing his way out of poverty, was still there beneath the tailored suits and dark sunglasses, still desperate to belong somewhere, anywhere. He found himself thinking about that hospital room in Philadelphia, Tammy's final weeks when her voice had been reduced to whispers, when she could barely remember the lyrics to songs they had made famous together. The smell of disinfectant and the sound of machines monitoring her weakening heartbeat had become the soundtrack of his nightmares. He would sit beside her bed for hours holding her hand, sometimes humming their songs quietly when she was too exhausted to speak. During one of those endless afternoons, when the pain medication made her drift between sleep and consciousness, she had suddenly gripped his hand with surprising strength. Her eyes, though clouded with fatigue, had focused on him with startling clarity. "Marvin," she had whispered, "when I'm gone, don't let them make you sing alone. Promise me you'll find another way." He had tried to protest, to tell her she would recover, but she had shaken her head slowly. "I've made my peace with it, baby. But you still have music to make. Just remember, harmony doesn't always need 2 voices. Sometimes it needs one voice brave enough to hold space for the missing one." The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure what he was doing here tonight either. His therapist had suggested it might help with the grief. Berry Gordy had framed it as good for his image, showing he cared about Detroit's struggling families. But Marvin had learned to distrust anything done purely for appearances. What had really drawn him here was a phone call from a social worker at a Detroit community center. Not through managers or assistants, but someone who had somehow gotten his home number, speaking about children going hungry while their parents worked multiple jobs, about families being destroyed by forces beyond their control. "Mr. Gaye," the woman had said, "these people need to hear from someone who understands what it means to lose something you can't replace." Detroit in 1972 was a city bleeding. The automobile industry was struggling. Urban decay was spreading through neighborhoods like a disease. Families who had migrated north seeking better opportunities were finding themselves trapped in cycles of poverty and despair. The inner-city relief concert was meant to raise funds and awareness, but mostly it was meant to remind people they weren't forgotten. From the wings, Marvin could see faces that reflected his own exhaustion. Mothers who looked aged beyond their years from constant worry. Fathers whose hands bore calluses from multiple jobs. Teenagers who moved with the careful restraint of those forced to grow up too quickly. These people weren't just dealing with economic hardship. They were dealing with the loneliness of urban life, the way cities could make you feel invisible, even surrounded by millions. Marvin recognized that isolation. Marvin understood their pain in ways that went beyond sympathy. Since Tammy's death, he had been living in his own kind of poverty. Not financial, but spiritual. Every morning he woke up reaching for a harmony that would never come. Every evening he sat at his piano, playing melodies that felt incomplete without her voice to complete them. The afternoon performances had been building energy steadily. Local gospel choirs had opened with songs that made the Fox Theater feel like a church. Young Detroit artists had delivered passionate calls for community unity. But the real electricity came when the Motown legends took the stage. These families knew every word to the Four Tops songs. They had grown up with Stevie Wonder's voice on their radios during long factory shifts. Marvin watched from the wings, studying the crowd's reactions. These people weren't here for entertainment. They needed music that acknowledged their struggles, validated their pain, and maybe offered a glimpse of hope. But there was something else Marvin noticed. When performers sang about love and happiness, the crowd responded with polite appreciation. When they touched on loss, on hardship, on the weight of carrying on despite everything, the audience became something different. They became participants. As his 15-minute slot approached, Marvin felt something he hadn't experienced since that night in Hampton. Not nervousness, but a peculiar clarity about what needed to happen. He wasn't here to entertain. He was here to share something that couldn't be packaged or marketed. During the Temptation set, Marvin overheard conversations that cut straight to his core. A woman telling her friend, "I keep expecting him to walk through that door, you know? Even after 2 years." A young father explaining to his wife why he had to work a second job, missing his children's bedtime stories. These weren't abstract discussions about grief and loss. These were real families carrying burdens that never got lighter, only more familiar. 20 minutes before his set, Marvin found himself in the theater's back corridor, away from the bustle of stage hands and equipment. He pressed his back against the cold brick wall and closed his eyes, trying to remember the last conversation he'd had with Tammy about performing alone. "If something happens to me," she had said during one of her hospital stays, "promise you won't disappear into that sadness." Music needs your voice, Marvin, even if it's just your voice. He had dismissed it then, told her nothing was going to happen, that they'd be performing together for decades. But Tammy had looked at him with those knowing eyes and said, "Sadness isn't the enemy of music, baby. Sometimes it's the only honest thing we have to offer." Marvin approached one of the families backstage, guests of the community center. A middle-aged woman sat with her teenage daughter, both wearing their Sunday best despite the obvious wear. "Excuse me," Marvin said quietly. "I'm about to go on stage. Mind if I ask what you want to hear?" The woman studied Marvin's face, seeing something in his eyes that reminded her of her own struggles. "Something that says it's okay to still be sad," she replied. "My husband passed last year. Cancer. Folks keep telling me to move on, but some loves are too big to just get over." Her daughter nodded. "Mama cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking. But I want her to know it's okay. That remembering Daddy doesn't make us stuck." The girl looked directly at Marvin. "Sing something true. Not about being over it. Something about how love doesn't just stop because someone's gone." Marvin felt something shift inside his chest. These weren't just random audience members. They were fellow travelers on the same difficult road he'd been walking since March of 1970. "Marvin, you're up in 5, a stagehand announced, barely making eye contact. Barry Gordy appeared beside him, placing a familiar hand on Marvin's shoulder. "You sure you can do this, son? No shame in waiting until you're ready." Marvin nodded, picking up his acoustic guitar. "No electric instruments today. No backing band. No Funk Brothers rhythm section. Just him and the songs that had first brought him to people's attention, back when he was still trying to figure out how to turn pain into poetry." The walk to the stage felt eternal. Behind him, the Motown family waited to see if their grieving brother could find his way back to music. Ahead, 8,000 people who understood what it meant to keep functioning when part of you had died. Marvin stepped into the spotlight at 9:47 p.m. The crowd offered warm applause, but their body language remained gentle, protective. He could see recognition in their faces, but also concern. This was the man who had made them believe in perfect love through his duets with Tammy Terrell. Now he stood alone. "Evening," Marvin said into the microphone, his voice carrying that familiar smoothness, touched now with something raw. "I haven't been on stage for a while. Been trying to figure out how to sing without my other half." He strummed his guitar, finding the opening chords to a song he had never performed live before. "You're All I Need to Get By," the duet he and Tammy had made famous. But tonight he would sing both parts. As Marvin began the song, something shifted in the audience. The polite attention transformed into something deeper. They weren't just listening to a performance. They were witnessing someone work through grief in real time, using music as a form of prayer. The Fox Theater, with its ornate ceiling and burgundy velvet seats, suddenly felt intimate despite holding 8,000 people. In the front section, an older woman closed her eyes and swayed slightly, not to the rhythm but to something deeper. A father in the balcony put his arm around his son, both recognizing something in Marvin's vulnerability that gave them permission to acknowledge their own losses. Throughout the theater, people found themselves thinking about empty chairs at dinner tables, voices they would never hear again, conversations that ended too soon. When he reached Tammy's verse, Marvin's voice cracked slightly. Instead of covering it, he let the break happen. The instrumental pause stretched longer than it should have, filled only by the sound of someone in the upper balcony quietly sniffling. "You're all I need to get by," he sang, and for a moment his voice was small, vulnerable, completely human. The crack in his voice became a crack in the collective heart of everyone listening. In the third row, an elderly man began crying quietly. Not for Marvin, but with him. His wife put her arm around him, and Marvin could see from the stage that they understood. This wasn't about a celebrity's loss. This was about the universal experience of loving someone who couldn't love you back anymore. Across the theater, other couples reached for each other's hands, recognizing their own struggles in Marvin's voice. When the song ended, the applause was different. It wasn't appreciation for technical skill. It was gratitude for honesty, for someone being brave enough to admit that some things don't heal, they just become part of who you are. Between songs, the theater remained completely quiet. 8,000 people waited in respectful silence, as if they were in church, as if they understood they were witnessing something sacred. "This next one," Marvin said, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised even him, "is for everyone who's ever wondered how you keep going when the music stops." He began, "What's going on?" but slower, more intimate than the recorded version. The song that had been a political statement became something more personal. A meditation on confusion, on trying to make sense of a world that takes away the things you need most. What happened next became one of those moments that people would carry with them forever. Without prompting, voices from the crowd began joining in. Not with the enthusiasm of fans at a concert, but with the quiet participation of people in mourning. They weren't performing, they were processing. "Mother, mother, there's too many of you crying," they sang together, and suddenly the lyric meant something different. Not about war or social unrest, but about the private wars fought in empty bedrooms, at kitchen tables, in the spaces where someone used to be. For his final song, Marvin chose Inner City Blues, but he changed the lyrics slightly, making them more personal, more immediate. "Make me want to holler, the way things are going," became "Makes me want to holler, the way things used to be." When his 15 minutes ended, the crowd's response was unlike anything the Fox Theater had heard before. Not celebration, but acknowledgement. They weren't applauding a performance. They were thanking someone for helping them feel less alone. Backstage, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Musicians who had been cautious now approached Marvin with genuine warmth. "That was healing, brother," Stevie Wonder said, embracing him. "You reminded us all why we make music in the first place." Berry Gordy found Marvin packing up his guitar. "You know what you did out there?" Berry asked. "You showed them that grief doesn't disqualify you from connection. It qualifies you for it." The social worker who had first called Marvin found him before he left. "Mr. Gaye," she said, "I watched you sing tonight, and I realized something. You weren't trying to get over your pain. You were trying to honor it. That's what these families need to see, that carrying sadness doesn't make you broken. It makes you human." As Marvin walked toward the exit, the mother and daughter from Backstage approached him one more time. "Thank you," the mother said simply. "For the first time in a year, I don't feel ashamed for still crying sometimes." Her daughter hugged Marvin briefly and whispered, "Keep singing for her. We'll keep listening." The next morning, Detroit radio stations began playing Marvin's duets with Tammy again. But now when people heard them, they thought about the man on the stage singing both parts, keeping the conversation going even when only one voice remained. DJs began taking calls from listeners, sharing their own stories of loss. More significantly, something had shifted inside Marvin. The performance hadn't cured his grief, but it had transformed it from something isolating into something connecting. Marvin Gaye walked onto that Fox Theater stage carrying the weight of irreplaceable loss and industry uncertainty. He walked off carrying something different, not healing, but purpose. The knowledge that sharing pain doesn't diminish it, but it does make it more bearable. Years later, when asked about that inner-city relief concert performance, Marvin would say simply, "Those people taught me something about what matters. They didn't need me to be over it. They needed me to be honest about it. That's all any audience really wants if you're brave enough to give it to them." The boy from Washington, D.C. hadn't found his way back to happiness that night, but he had found his way back to music. And sometimes that's enough to keep the conversation alive.